Oh, and good evening. It's July 3rd, 2025, and welcome to one of our Branches on the Vine videos featuring another teaching from the folks at Aleph Beta. I enjoy the connections across Scripture, the idea of putting ourselves in others' shoes, strapping on sandals, and the idea of understanding the characters. I'm reminded that these were real people with real agendas. And here at the Dusty Feet, we often try on sandals for the good and the not so good. And in this episode, from Rabbi David Block of the Parser Project, we explore a tale of two stories, both similar and yet distinct, and maybe worth a discussion of how we view God today in contrast to those whose sandals we might want to try on. So here we go with Can I Be Vulnerable with God? On Aleph Beta, on the Dusty Feet. Our hope with the Dusty Feet is to foster discussion and help build and support communities. If you are not already connected to a community or just want to share and interact, this community has 4 primary ways to interact. 1. DustyFeet.com. That's our primary place to find everything. You are always free to comment. 2. Facebook, at the Dusty Feet. These videos and other videos are also available for comment and discussion. And 3. We have a Discord channel. The invite link is there below. Be vocal, be written, be loving. And 4, and as always, you are welcome to send an email to bob@TheDustyFeet.com. These places, they will be moderated, and guidelines will be set to ensure healthy, safe discussion. And as always on the Dusty Feet, this is a place where we can safely explore the endless ways of God and the interconnection of His creation. Belief understandings may be challenged. Divine misunderstandings may exist, and traditional teachings might falter as we pursue connection, context, and community with God and each other here in an environment of grace and love. And of course, before we forget, if you do find these kinds of podcasts useful, so when you click that subscribe button, the reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think these might be useful to others, it is when you click that like button, because that is how YouTube will choose to share these to more people if they wish. Like I said, we try on sandals here. We try to see the lives of these characters, these real people in Scripture. And in doing so, we can perhaps gain a deeper understanding of what they were, at least we think they were going through. How we view God? Well, that's likely going to be underlying all that we're going to discuss. See, how do we see God today? How can relate to God today versus possibly those that we're talking about in the past? We might even hear echoes of God's Son, the Messiah, as we listen to this story. Something about daily bread. There could be more in that prayer that might be connected to maybe these stories as well. So let's have a listen, see where it takes us, ponder some thoughts along the way, because I expect some good discussion will be had. Enjoy.
Welcome to Parshat Bahalotra. Finally, the Israelites start traveling. For nearly a year, they've been connecting with God at Sinai. God spoke to the people through divine revelation. They built the Mishkan, where God's cloud came to rest with the people. And they were given laws through which they'd be able to live with God, always and everywhere. And now, at what should be the apex of Israel's relationship with God, what would we expect to hear? Sinai was the wedding. The past year was the honeymoon phase. And now, we're settling in for a long life together, right? But that's not what we find at all. The very first thing that people do after they start moving is complain. Did they suddenly forget that they had just been so close with God? What's going on? And many of us struggle with this part of the Torah because it's just hard to relate to. We read the stories in the Torah and we fall into the trap of judging the people. We think, if I were around back then, I would never have sinned like that. But the Torah isn't an ancient history book. It's meant to have timeless lessons for all of us, from a shepherd in the time of David to a stockbroker in 2016. So how can we understand and relate to this seemingly ungrateful chutzpahdik nation? Join us as we explore this story and figure out what we're supposed to learn from it. This week on the Parsha Experiment. Hi, I'm David Block, and welcome to the Parsha Experiment. So, the people complained to Moses, Mi yachilenu basar, if we only had meat. Zacharnu et hadaga asher nochal b'Mitzrayim chinam. We remember all the fish that we ate in Egypt for free. Ve'ata nafshenu yivesha, ein ko bilti el haman einenu. And now our souls are dried out. We have nothing except for the manna. And so God gives them slav, quail. Okay, so the people are about to travel and they complain about food. Does that remind us of anything? Look back at Exodus as the Israelites arrive in the desert. Despite their horrific experiences in Egypt, despite God having just rescued them, they complain. If only we died in Egypt. Ki hotzeitem otanu el hamidbar hazeh lahamit et kol hakahal hazeh b'ra'av. You brought us to this desert just to die of hunger. Look at that. Both stories take place at the beginning of Israel's travels in the desert. In Exodus from the Sea of Reeds and in Numbers from Sinai. And in both stories, the people long for food. And there's another similarity. Back in Exodus, God gives the people manna in response to their hunger, but he also gives them something else. Vayhi va'erev v'tal haslav v'tachas et hamachaneh. At night, the quails came up and covered the camp. And those same two foods are the focus in Numbers too. At some point after the story in Exodus, the quail stops. And now, in Numbers, the people complain that all they have is manna, which has continued to feed the Israelites since that very first story. And in response, Ve'agaz salvim min hayam vayitosh al hamachaneh. The wind brought forth quails from the sea, and they fell by the camp. The similarities don't stop there. Not only is the content of the complaint similar, but they both follow the same structural formula. In Exodus, they said, Mi yitain mutenu biyad Hashem be'eretz Mitzrayim. If only we had died in Egypt. Then, they reminisce about how good it was back in Egypt. B'shiftenu al sir habasar, ba'ochlenu lechem lesova, as we sat over our pots of meat, and were full with bread. But now, Ki otzeitem otanu al hamidbar hazeh lahamit et kol hakahal hazeh b'ra'av. You've brought us out to the desert, only to die of hunger. Those three elements, if only, reminiscing about Egypt, and then a description of how dire their current state is, are exactly replicated in the complaint in Numbers too. Mi ya'achilenu basar, if only we had meat. Then, Zacharnu et hadaga asher nochal b'Mitzrayim chinam. We remember all the fish that we ate in Egypt for free. And the cucumbers and watermelons and leek and onions and garlic. But now, ve'atad nafshenu yivesha, ein ko bilti el haman einenu. Our souls are dried out, we have nothing except for the manna. But there are also some jarring differences. In Exodus, they actually have no food. They're scared they'll die of starvation. But in Numbers, that's not true at all. They've had manna since the Exodus story. And yet, they complain as if the situation is the same. We're dried out, ein kol, we have nothing. Bilti el haman einenu, except for this manna. And look at God's response to the two complaints. In Exodus, God seems to understand the people. Oh, you're hungry? Here's food. He simply provides them with what they ask for. But God's reaction in Numbers couldn't be more different. Vayichar af Hashem ma'od, God was enraged. And ultimately, vayach Hashem ba'am makar rabba me'od. God struck the people with an extremely severe blow. So what's going on here in Numbers? Why do the people complain about food again, even though they already have food? And why does God react so differently to their complaint? The key may be in one last difference between the two stories. In Exodus, after the people complain, God says to Moses, Shamati et tlunot b'nei Yisrael, I've heard the complaints of the people. Taber alehem lemor, bein arbayim tochlu basar, uvaboker tisba'u lachem. Tell them that at night they'll eat meat, and in the morning, bread. Vidatem ki ani Hashem Elokeichem, so that they'll know that I'm God. What does that mean, so they'll know that I'm God? How could they not know? As we discussed back in Beshalach, after God took the people from Egypt, they doubted whether God was really with them, whether he would lovingly provide for them. And while the people perhaps should have believed, it seems that God understood that skepticism. After all, at that point, though he did save them, it was really all through destruction. God annihilated Egypt through the plagues. He obliterated their army at the Sea of Reeds. So yes, God is powerful, but loving? They had no idea what a loving God even was. God says, I get it. I'll show you that I'm with you, that I love you. I'll provide for you, tenderly, lovingly, with food. I'll give you manna and quail, and then I'll be with you at Sinai, and we'll spend a year getting close to each other. But now look at numbers. It didn't work. They still doubt. How is that possible? Maybe there's something deeper there. Maybe it was never really about faith in God. It was something else, masked in an issue of faith. And if that's the case, perhaps whatever the real issue was, that continued, even into Numbers. We think that the ultimate answer lies in the details of the first manna story in Exodus. When God provided the manna, it was given with two restrictions. First, when they collected each day, v'laktu davar yom biyomo, they could only take exactly the amount they'd need for that one day. And secondly, v'hechinu et asher yaviu, v'haya mishneh. They would collect double on Friday, but would not collect at all on the Sabbath. But why? I mean, what if they get hungry later? What is God trying to tell us by restricting how much and when we can take manna? Let's say I'm an Israelite. God just freed me from Egypt with incredible wonders. Now I'm in the desert, where God tells me, I know you don't have anything, but don't worry, I'll take care of you. Well, that's nice, but it's also scary, because I have no control. Forget about going to the grocery store to buy food. I can't produce anything. I can't even plant or harvest. I'm completely in the hands of God. I have no control. And we humans have a natural desire to be in control, because in our minds, control is a security. We want physical security, so we set up alarm systems. We want financial security, so we put our money into banks or in rock-solid investments. Because when we don't have security, when we're not in control, we're exposed, unprotected. We're utterly vulnerable. But there's a deeper level of vulnerability, emotional vulnerability. In this new relationship God is building with us, where he does everything from taking us out of Egypt to providing us with breakfast every morning, God says, this isn't going to work unless you're completely open to being in this relationship with me. I'll provide for you, of course I will. But you must give up control. Let yourselves be vulnerable and put your complete trust and love in me. So only take what you need for that day, not a morsel more. And if you can trust me, I'll never let you down. So when they complained back in Exodus, it wasn't only about a lack of food. And of course, they didn't actually want to go back to Egypt. At the heart of it all, there was a paralyzing fear of being vulnerable. In Egypt, at least they knew where their next meal was coming from. And now it's all up to God. Now, let's come back to Behalotra. This time, there's no worry of starvation. God has been providing them with food. They're just sick of manna. But there's something odd. Right after the complaint, the verses go into great detail about how the people would prepare the manna. V'tachanu varichayim odachu b'madocha. They'd grind it and pound it. Uvishlu b'parur v'asu oto ugot. They cooked it and they made cakes. The people are trying to process the manna, to put their own human stamp on it. They're trying to take control. They say that the issue is lack of food choice, but at its core, the people just don't want to rely on heavenly bread. We don't want to be completely vulnerable to God. It's precisely the same underlying issue of their complaints back in Exodus. And just like last time, it means something bigger. God, we're not ready to be completely vulnerable to you. And God's incredibly disappointed. That's why God responds so harshly. God says, I knew you were nervous to be completely vulnerable, to cede all control. So I was patient. I provided for you. I gave you rules to ease you into it, to help you learn that you can give up control, that you can rely on me. When I gave you food in the desert for the first time, I told you, if you follow in my ways, if you put your trust in me, Kol hamachala asher samti b'Mitzrayim lo asim alecha, all the destruction that I brought upon Egypt, I won't bring that upon you. I'll take care of you. You just have to let yourselves be vulnerable. But after all that, you still reject me. And therefore, in this week's Parsha, the relationship breaks down, and the people are met with that very destruction God warned them about. At the heart of the issue, both of these stories are about being vulnerable in our relationship with God. And that's a challenge we can certainly relate to. We try to control each detail of our lives, and we have such trouble relinquishing that control. Because yes, when we're vulnerable, we're exposed. We can get hurt. But it's also only through that vulnerability that we can build a deep and close relationship. Only when we trust God to love us and take care of us can we ultimately reach that epic level of closeness with God. Join us next week on the Parsha Experiment. Thanks for watching. To see the videos we referenced this week, see the description below this video. Thanks and Shabbat Shalom.
And we're back. So, what'd you think? There are a couple things that came to mind when I was looking at this or listening to it and trying to make these connections. Often we refer to these connections we do here as red string connections. I think there also might be multiple echoes. What I mean by multiple is that we often think of stories as echoes where we're looking for God's element in the story. And I think sometimes we also need to remember that we're going to see the human side, or what I would say our side of the echo in the story, when we've heard especially what we're doing now, and it's been echoed from the past, right? Because we're not new in this. We're just an echo from the past, and I'd probably say that might not always be a good echo. So I want to bring up a few points, a few things to remember, and remember, we're putting on the sandals of those in the story, trying to grasp as best we can because, well, truthfully, it's probably almost impossible. But still, at least we're going to give a good stab at how the interactions with God might develop and grow. Perhaps one could use the word mature over time. Fair? So one of the things I love is that the teachers within the Aleph Beta team, we most often hear from Rabbi David Foreman. We've heard from Emu Shalev, and in this one, we're hearing from Rabbi David Block. But I also appreciate how Rabbi Block highlights the elements that are important for us to consider when we examine these stories and how they can still impact and relate to us even today. So one of the things I enjoy is comparing stories, where we overlay two stories on top of each other, see the comparisons. They're like those children's books we used to look at in the doctor's offices, the dentist's office. I think they were called highlights. I could be wrong, but I think that's what they were called. And inside of them, there was one point where they had a page, and you flip it over, and the goal is to look at it and not cheat, but to see what's different when you looked at one picture and you turn the page and you looked at the other one. What's different from the original? Well, to be truthful, most of us would probably just flip back and forth, looking at the two, still trying to find the differences because they're hard. But the hardest way was to try to memorize the picture. Look at it, flip it. I'm not compelled to think that we shouldn't examine the other story, so I prefer that we examine both of them closely together, and then we're going to see how they're the same and how they're different. Because it's more than just time, as the rabbi brings up. It's not just time. It's the hearts of the people, their attitudes, and where they truly stand now, at that moment, in their relationship with God. I like the analogy that Rabbi Block uses in this part where they're departing Sinai, right? We arrived at Sinai for a wedding, which was held at Sinai, right? And now we're in the after honeymoon phase. Having spent a year there, that honeymoon phase, it's time to travel, time to go to our new home. Okay, so this would be a good time, if it's the post honeymoon, that we should be setting into our relationship. Yeah. Yeah, we seem to keep bringing up the past. Yeah. Do we see ourselves in this? Because yes, we're at the point, and it's interesting because we're past the honeymoon phase, because we have a thought, maybe something to consider, something to talk amongst yourselves. We've seen what God can do. Yeah, we've seen how this God can respond when he chooses to do so. And they see that when they come to the base of Mount Sinai. But still, there they do commit. They make a personal commitment. One could call it a prayer. One could call it an interaction. One could say, we will, I will. But this is not a get out of hell card, right? This is not, this is choosing, agreeing with, acknowledging God exclusively, and making his ways the focus of our own ways. So there at Mount Sinai, he gives us his ways, the way he wants his kingdom, that would be the land they're going to, with God as king, his kingdom, his will. We're also covering the kingdom a bit in our Outside the Class series, right? Where we happen to be in Samuel, we're with Saul, we're talking about the establishment of a king in this kingdom and how the ways that he was doing it are not being followed. But that's our challenge as well. Back to the story. So, in that phase, I'd say when we're going to follow God, right? Then God helps us understand how to follow him. He provides, right? We begin this life's journey as we get into the kingdom, right? What's interesting here is that we're getting into the kingdom is actually how the kingdom's already been set. Even at Sinai, it's already been established. They already know the expectations. This is what it's going to be like in the kingdom. These are the expectations. And are they willing to live that way even though they're not there yet? It's going to take them a while. They don't realize it's going to add 40 years. But can you hear the echoes? Can you hear where we're not yet in the kingdom? But how God wants us to live in that way? How we're choosing to respond to that? Maybe if you didn't hear it, or you didn't get the echo while listening to this, I'm going to get to another point where I think we get an echo of this very thought of how this is going to be from our Messiah. So I appreciated one of the points that Rabbi Block highlighted about the Hebrew scriptures, that not being an ancient history book. Yeah, they're ancient historical events that can be looked back on. They even can be confirmed. But the purpose of that is not to teach ancient history. It's to teach lessons. It's the repetition of cycles. It's these interactions between God and his people. Everything that we see is focused on the idea that any interactions he has with any other nations that are not his own, still these nations are directly connected to his people at that time and that place. Because, we don't have a history of China. We don't have a mention. We don't get the history of the British Isles. We don't even know what's going on in what we now call the Americas today, right? But we learn about God's interaction with his people in that place. And again, not for the history lessons, but for the relationship stories. Because I'll be fair, it's much easier to look at these things in retrospect, right? Because as we currently stand in 2025 with our understanding of this loving God, as we talked about here many times in the Dusty Feet, that in the time that they're living, that's not the vision. That's not the expectation or the understanding that they might actually be experiencing. The rabbi talked about that. Because in this particular story, it stands out that they had been coming out of Egypt, and all they've seen, right, are these massive plagues and these powerful things going on. And we're really not seeing many examples of this intimate, loving, caring God that we talk about so much today. But in their story, it does begin with food, with manna. Eventually, we get to add quail. On a personal level, we use the term sustainment, right, to refer to needs. Okay, I should probably add that to that list, the rabbi doesn't discuss it in his context, and I get why. I'm just saying that water is also involved in this, right, because it's what you need to live, to be sustained. So obviously, in the first story, they have a very different view of God. But then we have Sinai. They've been at Sinai now for a year, and now they packed up. They're moving on. They're supposed to be going to this land, this kingdom, and then we get to this story. So one thing to note is that upon examining the story, we find a few events that the rabbi doesn't mention in his account, right? It's not a matter of ignoring it because he's not doing that. He just simply doesn't bring them up. We're discussing some of those other things that would challenge this understanding of God and how we're relating and where their hearts are at, because we have the golden calf incident, the incident involving Korah, right? So these are things we need to think about. So I'm not sure that they all fall under the categories of comfortable, intimate, loving events. All those events, all of them, they're God's response when we're not acting towards Him, maybe in our comforting, intimate, loving way, and we choose not to want to live in His kingdom ways, even though we're not there yet. Other things can happen. So as the story unfolds, the rabbi discusses the comparisons between the two, right? So in the first story, there was no food. In the second story, they're complaining about the food they have. And in that, I think in that underlying selfish thought, right, there's really this genuine concern about us we should have about telling God that you're not giving me enough. I mean, we get into that when he starts talking about the control in them, and really when they're preparing the manna, right? It's undeniable that they've gone from no manna to now they've been working the manna. The need's met. It's just not enough. Again, it's almost uncomfortable to think how far we've come and how far we've fallen. Because you think we would be more mature, more aware. Yet the echoes we hear are, I want, but I don't want to live in your ways while doing it. I want it with no Sinai commitment, no relationship commitment. Every time we're called in Scripture to an interaction, to follow God's ways, to do God's ways, God never once tells them that you want to follow me or you're going to hell. That's not taught, okay? So what he's calling them to do, and we see that he wants a committed relationship. Not just saying we will, not just saying I will, right? At the base of a mountain, at the top of a mountain, walking down an aisle. What he wants is to acknowledge this relationship. And now that you're doing so, I think he expects a commitment. most often we draw analogies to a wedding commitment. Yeah. So I'm pretty well aware that it takes more than I do in front of a group of people with a pastor to say I'm married. Yeah. I think there's a life that follows that needs to and should adhere to that. And I have a sneaky suspicion that there are some expectations there. I suppose one of those things that lies beneath it, and we won't get a chance to talk about it today, right? But feel free to talk about it amongst yourselves. What you based your expectations of marriage on, what you base your expectations of a relationship with a spouse on, right? Because that's a thought that I think is worthy for another discussion at another time. For now, amongst yourselves. As the rabbi approaches the end, he discusses the details of the original manna story and then the second one. And he mentions that they've received their bread, how they obtain it, and it transitions into this. And I appreciated highlighting this aspect that he has of control. Yeah. Because I think actually he is spot on here, right? Are we comfortable with God's control? Because it's something we might pray about, right? We just prefer not to discuss it. It's part of this relationship that can get uncomfortable for us, because I think we reach a point where we want this cool, loving, very personal God, and yet we miss the point that He wants us to live in His ways, in His kingdom, with Him as King. Well, if you're living in His ways, in His kingdom, then there is control that's going to become an issue. We have the daily bread. Even in that, do you notice that there were days where, like as on Fridays, right, you were gathered double because it was your portion for that day and for the next, right? Some for more. So we have the days where we gathered more, like on that Friday. And then the other days, we didn't gather less. It was that day's daily bread. I think that's one of those things that we struggle with in terms of control. But is it scary because we're giving up something we want to hold on to? I want to do it my way. I want to have my relationship with you, God, on my terms. Yes, I think we see it expressed in marriage relationships that way. I think the success rate alone suggests that I believe this process is suspect. It's a point to which I wasn't immune to. Control. It's an uncomfortable topic. We're willing to interact with God and allow, right? Do we allow Him that uncomfortable control? Usually our hubris is involved, and I get it, but we at times can get critical when we're reading a story, when we're not even willing to look at ourselves and say, well, maybe we wouldn't do that, but are we willing to do the same? And as the title of this video suggests, right? Can we be vulnerable to God? I think that's a fair question, especially given by the time we reach this point, right? When we're talking about this, we're asking whether we can be vulnerable enough to God, right? Can we do that? Will we let ourselves be? And I think sometimes in this context, right, we often invoke the phrase, maybe there was just like a lack of faith, and which seems to be a prevalent response in these situations. And I'm not as compelled by that phrase, at least the way we tend to use it in this situation, right? I find more our challenge in being comfortable with giving up control to God. Not just choosing things that He thinks will be better for us, because that's an obvious one, but am I willing to give up control of my life and live my life the way You want me to live it? And I say that in the question, we say, I want to give you my life. Here, my life, here it is. So then God turns around and says, okay, this is what I want from you to do, to love me, to interact with me, to represent me. Because it's going to be genuine, it's going to be relevant, and it's going to be an example of how you should treat others on my behalf, right? But we go, oh, I don't want to do that. That's too hard. Or somebody told me at least that's too hard, or I'm not supposed to do that, or somebody told me that God's not about those kind of things anymore. And I struggle with that. So when it comes to looking at this, and when we look at the entirety of the biblical story that we have, I think there's more. And to be fair, the benefit, we'll be honest, we use the luxury of looking back, seeing so much of it and how much more of it, and seeing the abuse of it, and then thinking maybe we need to reconsider some thinking. Matthew 6, 9 through 15. Pray then in this way: Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. Do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For if you forgive others for their transgressions, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, and your Father will not forgive your transgressions. Yeah, I heard that when I was listening to this video. I did. Actually, I heard the entire Sermon on the Mount while listening to it. So I think it gives us something to think about and ponder when we have stories that are about us. You could say we sound like them, because as I mentioned, we are them. They are us. And there's that aspect we need to consider, is forgiveness. Last thought. I think there's a weird thing to think about that. Are we willing to forgive them? We love to complain about them, but are we willing to forgive? Because we desperately want to feel God's presence and forgiveness towards us. Something to ponder. So thanks again for being with us tonight for another Branches on the Vine with Aleph Beta and Rabbi David Block on the Dusty Feet.